Hello everyone, thank you for coming and welcome to this August 2022 edition of Logic Apps Live. I'm Derek Lee, I'm a PM on the Logic Apps team, and with me I have Parth and Wagner, as well as Kent, who is off camera, but will be helping us answering any of the questions that you may have. So for this Logic App Live, we figured we'll do something a little different. Usually we would share new features, upcoming features, talk about the plan, maybe give you a quick demo. But this time we figure we'll change it up and go through each PM here on the call and share some of our favorite tips and tricks and some of the features that you may or may not know in Logic Apps that hopefully will help you to build better, more efficient, and more performant Logic Apps. So I will start and then we'll hand it over to Parth and Wagner for them to go through theirs. But let's take a look at what I have prepared for today. I'm gonna switch to my desktop here. So I have two small things that I want to show. First is around inline code. Inline code is one of my favorite features. It allows you to write a few lines of JavaScript code from right within the Logic App Designer for you to do something really quickly. Like if you have a regular expression that you want to parse, if you have an array that you want to loop over, maybe do some manipulations. Great choice for that. And that comes standard in the Logic App Standard SKU. You don't even need to link to an integration account to be able to use it. So here you can see I have a Logic App Designer already opened and I have a inline code action. So actually I have to add a trigger first. So let me do that. We'll just do a recurrence trigger. Come on, Azure. Demo God is not with me today. Let me refresh. So while that is loading, I will talk about the problem. So in inline code action, you can reference the output from previous actions. And that is great because you may have an Outlook action, you may have an SAP action that takes in some input and that becomes the data that you want to manipulate. However, one of the things that people often do in Logic Apps is to use variables. And with variables, it's sort of a special token that you can't easily access from inline code, at least not yet. So I'm going to start with a recurrence trigger. And I am going to add a variable, initialize variable action. Let's just call it maybe name. It's going to be a string and the value will be Derek. So we'll add another action here. I will use the inline code action. And by default, you will see that there's no dynamic content available to me. I can't reference this name string variable. Now this question come up once in a while. People be like, how am I supposed to work with it? The trick that I use is to use a intermediate action. I often just use compose from the data operation. Right, so for compose, I can select the variable as the input into compose, and then when I come back to my JavaScript action, I can then reference output as the value, which will contain the same content as my variables. So you can see that when you select from the token picker and insert that into inline code, we insert a slightly different tokens, right? Rather than the token that you may be familiar with, there is this object called workflow context, and then you can keep dereferencing. You can say .actions, .compose, .outputs. So that's trick number one. The second thing I want to show, let me actually switch to Visio, build this nice diagram for you. This came up from one of the internal teams here at Microsoft who want to use Logic App to power their user experience. Now, what they want to do is a scheduling-based Logic App, so to turn on and off the compute instance so that their customers can save some money when it is just sitting idle, not being used. Now, this has been done quite a lot from the very early days of Logic Apps. It can be as simple as having a recurrence trigger and just call the endpoint to turn on and off, for example, a virtual machine. But this particular team actually want to have some additional capabilities for their customers, a little bit more flexible implementation in the sort. So what they want to do is, suppose the shutdown happens at 6 p.m. every day. At 5:50, about 10 minutes before the scheduled shutdown, they want to be able to notify their users and be like, hey, this instance is going to be shut down in 10 minutes. Are you okay with it? Or if you're not, if you're still using it, click this button. So we'll skip the shutdown and then the instance will stay live. You can keep using it. Maybe you have some work already scheduled for it to run during the evening times. So let's take a look at how I can do that in Logic Apps. I'm going to use the same Logic App. I will just delete a bunch of actions that I just added. You can right click on actions to delete. Here's another trick for you. Let's change this to, we'll run this every day, and then we'll run this at 5 p.m. and at the 50-minute mark. So that is my recurrence trigger. It runs 10 minutes before the scheduled shutdown is supposed to happen. I'm gonna build the main scenario first. So I'm gonna, let's see, what do I want to do? I want to do a schedule. I want to do a delay, and we'll delay it for 10 minutes, right? So after this action, we'll be looking at the 6 p.m. mark. And this is where I can start implementing my logic to shut down whatever instance that I care about. I usually put my stuff inside the scope so that I know what I'm doing and I can easily rename it here. So I call this like shutdown VM, let's say. And here I'm just gonna use an HTTP action because we're not gonna be looking at how to shut down a virtual machine. We have documentations on that if you want to take a look at. But I'm just gonna pretend that I will be calling an API to shut down my virtual machine. But what I'm gonna do in addition is to add a parallel branch. In this parallel branch, I'm gonna use the HTTP webhook action to simulate sending out a notification. So let's do HTTP webhook. Here I have a request bin already opened. I'm gonna create a new bin. This is gonna be my receiver for that webhook call. So let's do a post. And then I will subscribe to this endpoint. And in the body, I will pass in the callback URI. So this is going to contain an URI that I would be able to invoke to trigger and resume the execution of my Logic App. What I'm going to do after, so this is in the case that I received a callback. I'm going to use the control group and I'm going to terminate it. I'm going to mark it as succeeded. And here, I'm also going to add a control action, terminate, and mark it as succeeded as well. You know what? I'm actually going to change this to canceled so we see two different behavior. Now, let me save the workflow. So if I refresh, we should be making a subscribe call anytime now. Oh, I set it to run at 5:50, so I have to manually trigger it, I think. So let me do that. All right, so here you can see that the webhook call has been made. In the raw body here, I have the callback URI. Let me actually do a quick refresh here and show you the runs if I can. Oh, I got logged out. Oh, got a couple of runs. Let's take a look at the last one. All right, so here you can see that this is being delayed. My webhook is also waiting for a response. So what happened is, if as a user, if I don't do anything, the delayed action will complete in about 10 minutes, and then I will proceed to shut down my virtual machine and then mark the run as completed. The webhook side of the branch will be ignored. But if as a user I want to cancel the run, I want to cancel the shutdown, I would be able to use this callback URI. In Postman, I will just do a post to this new endpoint. I'll send a request. You can see it's 200 accepted. And if I go back, maybe let's do a quick refresh. So you can see that the webhook call received the callback, indicating I want to skip or abort that shutdown. And we terminated the call, we terminated the run after receiving the call. Therefore, the shutdown would not happen. So that is my tips and tricks of the day. Hope you like it. And now I'm gonna hand it over to Parth to show you some of his favorite things. Parth, go ahead.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks a lot, Derek. Yeah, so I can start. And what I'm going to do is just start sharing my desktop as well. Cool. Then you can all see my screen. So thanks everyone for joining, and thanks, Derek. So today I'm just going to start building an API, which sort of what it does is process orders and sends it to the downstream system. In this case, the service bus. What I'm trying to show is a few tips and tricks starting from try catch, and then on we'll see like adding comments or even using how to use scope. So without further ado, we can just jump right in. So I have this stateless workflow that I've created, and what it does is, right now, I have to be able to add a trigger and a few actions. But before I jump in, just wanted to lay a few words on try catch. So try catch allows you to test out a few lines of code in the try block and catch any exceptions in the catch block, with finally including any business logic that will execute anyway, regardless of the try and catch. So I can just start building the API by the HTTP trigger, which we have. What I will do is pass in the order number and the amount as the parameters, which we can pass into the API. So in this case, I've just added a couple, and then I will go about adding another action where I'll just set up a couple of variables to make sure that if the order is processed, we respond accordingly and with a confirmation number. So I'll just set up a couple of variables. So I think Derek talked about initializing variable, which is what we will do as well. In this case, we will set multiple. So we have the processed variable, which we will set it to false for default, so the order is not processed. And I think we can just say setting up processed variable. So yeah, you can obviously rechange the name of the action itself. And then I'm going to set up another variable for the confirmation number, which I will let it be as integer in this case. And enter the initial value as 1, or actually let's set the default as 0. So if there is 0 that is returned from the API, we know that there is no confirmation. So now I'll start with the try and catch. So the way I'll do this is by adding the scope, and that is basically an action which can include a set of actions within it, and you can then govern how you can go about adding the actions to it and executing them to run after. So in this case, I will add the conditional logic to check if the order is above a particular amount. Then we will make sure to route it to another queue, and if it's greater than some amount, we'll route it to another queue. So in this case, the amount, let's say if it is greater than let's say 1,000, I want to make sure it is handled through a different queue. In this case, I will add an action to just send the message to the downstream system. So yes, we have the service bus and send message. It is already connected to one of my queues that I've set up. So all I need to do is just have the name. So in this case, it will be received small order. Yes, I have written down the queue names just to make sure that I do not forget. And then if it is greater than, I think we want to route it to the smaller queue. And in this case, we also want to include the content. So, and same for here. I think this should be large order. And what we can add is the order number, right? So it would be number and the amount. So we will have the order number and the amount, which you can obviously select from dynamic content. And I will just basically copy paste this and make sure I do the same for the other queue. And once that is done, let's go ahead and make sure that we set up the message state so to be processed. So in this case, the processed will then be true. And then we will also make sure to generate a random confirmation number in this case, which we can yet again use a set variable for, and then we can use expressions. So there is the random expression which you can use, which has the minimum value and maximum value. In this case, I can use from 1 to 9999 because 0 in our case is the order is not processed. So it can basically generate an integer from there on. Once that is done, I will go about catching the exception. In this case, I just want to have a simple, so we don't have the catch. What we will do is add the scope. I just want to be able to add a simple dead lettering the message action. So in this case, we just save. So it'll again be a send message action, which will make sure that this message is not lost, and we'll go to at least some queue. In this case, it's the dead letter. Perfect. And once that is done, I will also add the content just to make sure, which was the order and amount. And now, here is where you need to make sure that you use run after. There's another tip and trick, right? So you go to run after and you see that choose the actions and conditions that this should run after. In this case, scope. So we open it up. We only want it to run when scope fails. So it actually isn't successful, but it rather has timed out, skipped, or has failed. So that is what you can set up. So this will only run if the try fails. And let's actually rename this to catch. And then this to try. Another tip and trick is to actually add comments. So just like any programming language, you can make sure you add comments. In this case, this will execute only if try fails, skipped out. So yeah, and you can obviously see that comment right here, which helps in clarity for you as well as any of your teammates who are accessing the app. Once that is done, I'll just add a finally. In this case, what I'm going to do is just return the response. So this will simply have just one response action, and it will return me the exact confirmation number and the process state. But now that I realize, before I do that, I need to make sure that I compose the JSON. So what I will do is add a compose action, and that will basically make sure that I am setting up my JSON object properly. So in this case, I'm doing confirmation number And I will set this up to confirmation, and then processed state, which should be also set up to processed. And once that all of it is done, what I'm going to do is simply send out the outputs with a successful status code. So that is it. Let's give this a save. Hopefully this goes through well. And once that is done, we can test it out through Postman. Now, given that I'm testing, I at least want to make sure that I see the runs of it, because what if the workflow is wrong and I don't get a response back? I just get status false. So how can I convert this stateless mode of the workflow to a more of a stateful mode through which I can see run history, right? So which is another tip and trick to enable the debug mode, which will then let you see the run history of the stateless workflow. This obviously will store the inputs and outputs in your storage account for the Logic app. And it will also compromise in latency, so use it wisely. But once that is done, here's what I'm going to do. Actually, I'm just going to copy this particular URL and set up Postman. In this case, I have an order ready. So the order number is some integer, and I'm passing it an amount less than 1,000, which should then route to the smaller queue. So I'm just going to send and see what happens to the workflow run. And we can also visualize what exactly went wrong. So process state is false, which should not be the case. So we'll see what exactly went wrong. Let's see. It has succeeded. Oh, there is a bad request. Let's see. Receive small order. Okay. I think this may be due to that. Let's see. I'm going to try and go back to my app and see the designer and what the name of the queue is. Let's see. And what we can do this time is try and make sure that this actually routes to the right. Yeah, well, it was the name. So I think what I'm going to try and do is pass in a larger amount to check if it actually goes to the bigger queue, in this case, to the downstream. So it seems like there's something going wrong in the app. So let's see once again. What I'm going to do is actually, I did have, an API that I was creating this yesterday itself, which is the same. So if you see, this was actually a proof of concept, and that was in the development environment, which does, the same, in which I'm using the same, queues, generating the confirmation, setting the process as true, catching the exception, and doing the finally. Oh, actually, now that I realize, one of the things that I may have gone wrong with is, just a second, refreshing this. Is actually the finally block, that I did not add the particular run after settings to the finally block. Just to make sure that I did, you have the red lights and I don't have it here. So just to make sure that, we also have the finally execute after any of it. So we'll set it all to make sure that if catch fails or is successful, finally still runs about. And what I'm going to do, rather, instead of calling this API, I'm going to call it the proof of concept to check out and see what happens if we do pass in the order. In this case, I'm going to make sure that I'm enabling the debug mode, and I will soon be passing this to Wagner too. Just a second. And I'm going to try and send out requests with 100,000 or 10,000. Yeah. Well, ideally, it should be giving me the exact state, which in this case should be uh, true, but we're just going to make sure we check. Maybe the queues are down. Actually, yeah, that may be the case. So what I'm going to do is try and just set it up to $200,000, 200,000, uh, and see if this actually goes through. Well, there we go. So it did, and the smaller queue was down, I believe, due to which we passed in a larger value, which went through the larger queue, and the process was true. So if you just see the execution really quick, you will be able to see that the try block was executed in this case. And here you go. Just a second. I opened the wrong one. There you go. So the try block was executed. It was sent to the larger order with a pretty fast latency, I would say. The catch was not executed because you don't want to execute catch if the try has, and the finally was regardless to make sure that it sends the response out. So apologize for the little bit of lag in the demo there, but thank you so much for bearing with me, and that is all I had. So Wagner, I'll pass it on to you.
And I was on mute, so let me share my screen quickly and we can start. Just give me 1 second. Right. So I'll do something a little bit different, right? So that both Derek and the path was really brave doing some of the stuff live. I actually going to be talking about some of the other components that it might be giving you some grief when you're doing deployments, or when you started a proof of concept and then you needed to continue on Visual Studio Code. So the two things that I'm going to be talking about, one is the authentication of Azure Managed Connections, both locally and on the portal, right? It's something that I saw a lot of people having a bit of trouble of that and trying to understand the concept. Then I'll talking to you about like a little hidden gem in the portal that allow you to download those logic apps, like the logic apps that Path or Derek just created. What if you wanted to continue that development on Visual Studio Code, right? After you created first proof of concept in the portal. So how can you do that? And after that, I have like a couple of asks for you, right? I have some items that we are tracking that you might be able to help us. So let's start with the managed connections and the authentication. So I'll show you that on Visual Studio Code as well. So in this case here, I have that logic app that creates when an HTTP received, it does like initialize a variable, does some evaluation of the operation that you send in, and depending on the action that happens, it publishes an event on Event Grid, right? So what we wanted to talk about a bit is about this EG Publisher connector. If you go to our connections.json, we're going to see that Azure Grid Publish connector is created, and we have one thing here called authentication, right? When I saw that first time, I really thought that authentication was like the authentication of the connection against the resource, but it's actually not. This authentication there is the ability to the logic apps resource connect to the connector. Inside the connector, you have all the connection, all the credentials that you needed to talk to the other system, right? And when you're running that locally, because you still don't have Azure resource to bind that using managed identity, that's why that authentication here is raw. And then behind the scenes, the Logic Apps, what it does to you is it goes and creates that creates a token that is valid, if I'm not wrong, for 7 days, right? And this way you're able to use that connection to kind of fake that you have an Azure resource to use that. And that's how you're able to use the managed connector that is in Azure when you're executing that locally. The problem happens when you needed to go and publish that into the Logic Apps, into the portal. Because if you publish with that, what's going to happen is that token is going to disappear after 7 days. And then you think that you needed to redeploy that connector to get that again. The difference that you have is when you're running that locally, as I said, that authentication is that type raw with a schema key and a parameter that is like a connection key. But when you're running that in Azure, the authentication type of that should be managed service identity. And as part of your deployment, you should be also deploying ACL, so that the connection between your Logic App and this connector, right? So if I jump into the portal quickly, you're going to see that just let me get that same Logic App. What you're going to see here on my connections. Come on, refresh. Man, demo gods are not with us today. What is my sample? That one. Ah, finally. So this is another Logic App that has a Key Vault connector reference, right? So what I'm going to show here is just notice that the name of that Logic App is Key Vault config entries. And if I go to the connection, the API connection, you have an area called access policies. When you look into the access policies, you're going to find now that is a new policy connecting the Key Vault connection entry to that connector. This is what allow now during runtime or even during design time, the Logic App to access that API connection to then be able to execute things through it. And you can do that manually, but we don't ask you to do that. There is an ARM template that you can put together with your deployment to guarantee that you'll be able to deploy the connection, deploy the Logic Apps, and do this hooking up, right? If you wanted to go deeper into that and understand a little bit more, there is a part of one of our articles that talks about that. But more than that, there is a new there is a new blog post that was created a little while ago. That in this blog post, we're talking about that and how we're creating that connection and that access policies. So we have more details here. and you actually have some sample, excuse me, some sample ARM templates that shows exactly how you to do that, right? So if you wanted to know more, if you wanted to make sure that you can connect all those things together, you should be able to take a look at that. So that was my first tip, or actually cautionary tale, because if you don't follow those steps, what's going to happen is you potentially your the connection is going to end up like losing connectivity with your logic apps when it's deployed to the portal. The last thing before I go to the next one is when you're creating that from the portal, because you already have a resource, behind the scenes, all of that is being taken care of for you, right? So when you're creating a new Azure connection in the portal, it's already connecting using managed identity, your logic app, and your connector, so you don't have to worry about that. But you still needed to worry about that when you deploy into other environments. So next trick, that is a little bit more hands-on, right? Now that I have like a set of logic apps created in the portal, how can I go and grab those logic apps and bring down to the Visual Studio Code to continue working with that from there? So let's take a look at that same logic app. Let me grab a little bit of water because. So this is a logic app standard that has one workflow, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, we have this HTTP trigger workflow. And inside of that, you have like, you do an HTTP, you do a list keys, and then you do a response, right? So really, really simple. And this has one managed connector, right? And do we have any parameters? No, we don't have any parameters, but I'm going to create a parameter here just in case. So we have like the full set. Very original name. So after I save this, and I go down to parameters, I have now one parameter. What happens if I wanted to get all of that? I wanted to bring it to Visual Studio Code because I wanted to push to source control. I wanted to parameterize all of that to continue working and expanding that logic app, but then set up my CI/CD and everything. There is a little button here that not everyone noticed called Download App Content. And on that Download App Content, I can select the site content. I can select to include or no the app settings. So if you don't have any app settings that you created to use with your application, you don't need to do that. But if you created any app settings that you wanted to bring down to continue your experience, you can click the app settings, right? And then when you click on download, it's going to generate a zip file. That I can save. And now if I go to my folder, and first just look at the content that you have here, you see that we have the connections JSON, the host, the local settings, the parameters, and I have my HTTP trigger. Right, so I'll expand that. Then if I go to see if that is going to work. Open with code. Ah, sorry guys, open the wrong one. I wanted to open that one. Okay, so it found all of that, right? And it detected that is a project of type functions because it's the item that comes before logic apps, right? But if I click on yes on that, it's going to be creating I think it's going to be this. Let's see what it's going to do here. It should create a .vs code folder for that. And then after that, I'm able to open my workflow on the designer. Going to take some time to open up. And there we go, right? Because I didn't connect that to Azure, then it's not finding my connection that's already created here. But if I connect that to the Azure connector that has that logic app in place, it is going to find that. I should have done that. Like use connectors from Azure. And the resource group for that is WCVera Sandbox, if I'm not wrong. By the way, when you're doing that use connections from Azure, what it's going to do is going to include a couple of the entries here. Workflow subscription ID, workflows tenant ID, and workflows group name. So let's see if it's able to find that one now. There we go. So now it's able to find my connector in Azure, and because of that, I can see all of these things, right? So this is a way for you to grab some proof of concept that you created in Azure, and now bring to Visual Studio Code to continue working with that here, and be able to then parameterize, and everything that you have created there has been imported, so you can continue your work here. You don't have to recreate your logic apps if you started creating that on the portal. So that was my second tip. Now, for a couple of asks, right now we have a survey running to understand a little bit better how you're using logic apps, if you're using logic apps standard, developing through the portal, developing from local, how you're doing DevOps, what is the main pain points of that, right? So if this survey is open until tomorrow. If you didn't manage to go and complete that survey yet, it takes like 15 minutes, and you can go to akams/logic/app/standard/devx survey, right? The other thing is the export tool that we've been discussing before is really close to completion. Probably on the next Logic Apps Live, you would be able to show a demo of that. But right now, we're looking for people that is interested in help with the private preview. The main prerequisite for the private preview is that you have an ICE environment available, because the first component that we target is ICE. Really soon after that, we're going to be targeting consumption as well. So if you wanted to help and you have like a nice environment that you can use to export some logic apps, go to the aka ms/la standard/export and private preview, and fill in the form so we can get in touch with you to enroll you on the private preview. So those were my tips and my asks.
All right, cool. Thanks, Wagner, and thanks, Parth. A really great insight, and I hope you enjoyed it. So, do you like the content? Do you like the format? Let us know in the comment down below, whether you're watching this live or if you're watching a replay. If there's any more topics that you would like us to cover in the next Logic App Live, definitely submit those as ideas, and we'll see what we can do. But before we wrap up, let's see if there is any questions that we should get to. So I think there's a comment that we addressed, but just to reiterate, some performance issue with the workflow designer. This is something that the team is working very hard on, and we hope the improvement for the workflow designer will be available in the coming month. So keep an eye on that. Really excited changes that will be coming out as part of it. There was also another question on initializing variable, the wish to be able to do that in bulk rather than have one actions per initialized variable. Heard that loud and clear. We have gotten that feedback a few times, so we'll certainly look into it and see what we can do after the major updates that we'll be making into the designer code base. Wagner, I think there's maybe a question for you with regards to the 7-day expiration of the token. Is that something that can be changed?
From what I remember, this is on the is on the designer, so that expiration time cannot be changed, but that was only supposed to be used locally, and inside Visual Studio Code is going to be renewing that for you, right? But on the portal, before you deploy, you should be changing that connector to manage identity, and after that, you don't have problem with that anymore.
Cool. Sounds
Does
good.
that answer?
All right, we'll keep an eye on the comments, but I think that is all we have for today. Again, thanks for your coming, and let us know your feedback, comments, or just suggestions that if you have any. We'll keep the chat open for a few more minutes just in case you have any more questions. But again, thanks for coming, and see you next time.